I'm joined now by 6 people who have very different views on whether or not the rising was justified. Arguing that it was, are Fianna Fáil TD and grandson of Eamon de Valera, Eamon Cuiv, former Taoiseach, barrister Michael McDowell, who's also the grandson of Owen McNeill, the man who tried to call off the rising, and historian Ronan. Arguing that it wasn't justified are journalist and Sunday Times columnist Kevin Myers, Irish Times religious affairs correspondent Patsy McGarry, and historian Ruth Dudley Edwards, who you saw there in Barry's report. Michael McDowell, if I could start with you. What you had here was a tiny minority plotting to use violence to achieve their aims without any mandate whatsoever. It's very hard to argue that that was justified.
Well, it depends what you mean by justification. Any revolution against the greatest empire on the planet with the greatest intelligence service that was available, any such revolution is going to be plotted in secret by a group of people who have to keep what they're doing secret. And they're not going to go and have a referendum beforehand, or there wasn't an Irish Parliament which could back them. You also have to bear in mind, and the film piece that we just saw didn't deal with this in such great depth, and that is that violence in Ireland had been enshrined in 1912 by the Tories in England and the Ulster Unionists. They had set up the bones of a provisional government in Ulster backed by weapons. Okay, well, so the Irish volunteers were in effect responding to British violence in Ireland to stop Home Rule.
But this wasn't the Irish Volunteers, this was a tiny minority within the Irish Volunteers. Your own grandfather, the Chief of Staff of the Volunteers, disapproved of the rising.
Exactly. I mean, it's a morally complex thing. I'm not suggesting that McNeill was wrong in his view. He took the view that if you were going to use force, and he was willing to do that in 2 circumstances. 1, if the British tried to disarm the volunteers, or 2, if there was a reasonable prospect of success. And those were the 2 conditions on which he was operating. The rebels planned a deception of him. They forged a Castle document to suggest that the British were about to disarm the volunteers. And in those circumstances, he wavered between supporting a rising or not doing so. And when he finally became convinced that there was no prospect of success and that the Castle document was a forgery, he countermanded the rising on the principle, on the moral principle, that he felt that you couldn't unleash violence without a reasonable prospect of success.
But you don't disagree with him?
I mean, I don't disagree with that view, no. And I think he didn't change his view afterwards, but as soon as he was imprisoned himself, he got life imprisonment in Dartmoor for his sins. And as soon as the 1918 election took place, he and his 3 sons threw themselves completely into the War of Independence, because looking at the situation that had then arisen, he thought that the use of force was now justified and had a prospect of success.
But that's the point. It wasn't, in his view and in the view of lots of people, it wasn't justified in 1916 because there hadn't been that democratic mandate.
That's correct. But I mean, you also have to look at it this way. He wasn't like James Connolly, a revolutionary socialist who believed that you could light the spark and a revolution would come. That wasn't his view of the world. Likewise, he wasn't like Pearse and MacDonagh and Clark. He wasn't willing to soak the blood of Ireland by way of a blood sacrifice as a piece of political and historical theatre. But you see, we have to be very, very careful when we talk about moral justification, because moral justification in the eyes of people like Pearse was that British occupation of Ireland was unjustified. The only way to bring it to an end was to engage in an act of rebellion. And that is a view of the world which is tenable. And I think if you look forward again from 1916, virtually nobody really seriously contends that Irish freedom was available other than through armed struggle with the British Empire.
We'll get into some of those issues in a moment. Eamon Cuiv, as Michael says, you can't have a referendum about whether or not you should have an insurrection. But I mean, there was no attempt made to even find out what the people wanted. These people just looked into their own hearts and decided that that gave them the right to take other people's lives.
Well, first of all, the most fundamental taking of rights was the right taken by the British Parliament to themselves, that it was their choice and their choice only as to what happened on this island. Now that's the first thing we have to understand. I believe that that right fundamentally belongs to the Irish people, totally independent of any wishes of anybody living on a neighbouring island. Now, the second issue, of course, that you have to ask is, if they had openly declared a Republican Party that wanted a referendum for a republic, what would have happened? Ireland was policed by the RIC, which was not an ordinary regular police force. It was a paramilitary force in barracks whose job was to spy on the people to make sure that they weren't in any way going to undermine the empire, because Britain was aware of the Irish wish for independence, home rule or independence. And really what was limiting the Irish wish was what might be achievable, not what they desired. Now, the third thing that's very interesting, in the aftermath of the Rising, when De Valera and the rest of them were released, they tried, through a boycott of the RIC and so on, to use peaceful means to achieve their political ends. What happened? All their organisations, including Sinn Féin, were declared outlawed. And therefore, the British Empire clearly said, we cannot let Ireland go, because if we let Ireland go, it's the one little stone that brings the whole empire down. And any notion that the British Empire was going to give up its vast wealth right across the world, its dominance of the world, for little Ireland, I think is slightly naive.
But you made the point that they didn't put a programme before the people. But there was a separatist party, a peaceful separatist party, Sinn Féin, in the era before the Rising, and it did contest elections and it got nowhere. Well, so the people, the implication is the people didn't want it.
Well, it wasn't that the people didn't want it, because when the people had the courage, and there was a universal franchise, or a very nearly universal franchise, in 1918 and repeated in 1920, so you cannot say it was just purely a conscription mood. They voted very clearly what they wanted. They wanted complete separation of a republic. But the idea that the British were going to even countenance any successful political movement and grant independence through referendum without interference in Ireland, in my view, is absolutely naive. And the other thing that's interesting about all this worry about, this big debate about the justification of the Rising, nobody questions a much greater conflagration that cost 38 million lives. And that is this crazy world war that was going on between imperial families, all of whom were related, and who were not exactly democratically elected either.
Okay.
And therefore, to suddenly worry about democracy in a world where the leaders of these powers had no respect for democracy, the Kaiser, the King, or the Tsar, do you think they worried about democracy? And we suddenly are meant to, in this island, say, well, we can ignore their total disregard for democracy, and we're meant to, in some way, say, well, we'll do it some democratic way that nobody yet has indicated was available in any meaningful way. OK, well, let me bring in Ruth Dudley Edwards. Ruth, among many other things, you've written a book, you wrote a book some years ago about Pádraig Pearse, and you've mentioned, of course, his address to the great Home Rule demonstration outside on O'Connell Street in 1912. And when he said at that time, if we are cheated this time, there will be red war in Ireland. And Pearse took the view that the Irish people had been cheated by the delay in Home Rule and the introduction of partition.
Pearse is a very unusual case in that he was driven by a death wish. Now, the problem when we look back at 1916 is that Pearse was the man with the way with words. I mean, he was a phenomenally brilliant propagandist, utterly brilliant. And he constructed a whole vision of the past which suited his take on it all, and which turned Irish nationalism into a religion. It was all bound up with Catholicism, and him as Christ.
Yeah, but there was plenty of other people involved who weren't going down that particular path. Tom Clarke was a very hard-headed individual indeed.
So many of them were going down different paths. I mean, the point I would make here, and that's quite a big one, I absolutely accept that they were inspired, that the Irish volunteers wouldn't have happened without the Ulster volunteers. I mean, that's absolutely true. We're all very tied up in it together, and there's responsibility all around on this one, no question about that. But having said that, there were 500,000 people signing the Covenant up north, and there were 7 people signing the Irish Proclamation. Now, that's not much of a tribute to democracy.
Kev Myers, people would argue that there are some things that are worth fighting for. Arguably, there are some things that are worth dying for. And there was plenty of Irishmen who found that led them to Flanders and to France. And there was other Irishmen and women who found that it led them here to the GPO.
Yes, and it was Eamon is quite right about the millions of people who died on the Western Front. It was a time of great war, and war had contaminated all values, but it doesn't mean that you're immune to the moral obligations about what is a just war. And one of the stipulations of a just war is, can you win? And could the men and the women of 1916 have won on the terms that they were proposing? And the answer is they could not in 1916, could not in 1919, could not in 1921 or 22. If you take on the British Empire, you will lose. That's what happened. Nobody in 1916 in the GPO wanted a partitioned Ireland. That's what they got. Not merely was it a partitioned Ireland, the Act of Union wasn't merely retained, but the Orange majority was given control over the nationalist minority. And the terms of the treaty that were exacted on the Irish delegation in 1921 were so severe that we had a civil war. But the British retained most of their strategic interests. They kept control of Irish waters, they kept control of the seaports, our delegates, our representatives, our TDs had to sign an oath of allegiance to the King as head of the Commonwealth, and we
gone within 15
we
years.
remained inside the Commonwealth. Not one of those things would have been recognisable to the garrison of the GPO in 1916.
And yet they would argue that they weren't looking for a victory in 1916, they were looking for a victory sometime down the road. How can you say they didn't get it
by 1921? They didn't get it by 1921. Now, what happened in subsequent years is a different issue, and Eamon de Valera, and Ronan's going to talk about that, I'm quite sure, manipulated the politics very brilliantly in subsequent years. But what violence actually achieved was none of the objectives that were set out in the proclamation of 1916.
OK, I better let Ronan in there, because I think he's eager to answer that point.
I mean, let's just, a couple of points. First of all, the prediction that there would be red war, that there would be, whatever it was, there would be bloodshed, Ireland would run red. That wasn't just made by Pearse. That was made by the British Prime Minister, Henry Asquith, in November 1913, in a memorandum to the King, when he said, if the Home Rule Bill does not become law in the next year, yet again, for the third time, the Irish people will have been deprived, will have been denied what they have thought of, what they have consistently voted for as their right. The reality is, and the reason that it gets back to something Michael said about the militarism of 1912 to 14, the reality is that British parliamentary democracy had failed in Ireland, had irrevocably failed in Ireland.
But the Home Rule Bill was. But the Home Rule Bill was on the statute book with a suspensory clause.
But what's much more important was that it was suspended for the duration of the war. Now, Redmond, admittedly, was very unlucky. He, like so many other people, thought the war would be over by Christmas 1914. If that had happened, one doesn't know. But I mean, put not your faith in princes. Well, I would say put not your faith in British governments. And there is not a shred of evidence to suggest that, not one shred of evidence to suggest that if it hadn't been for the violence, if it hadn't been for the Irish Revolution, the British government wouldn't have moved to a larger measure of independence. When they finally have to return to Ireland after the war, the offer is the same. Home rule, except it's 2 home rule parliaments, not 1. And I absolutely would contest what Kevin says about the outcome in 1921. Henry Kissinger talked about America's debacle in Viet Cong, in Vietnam. If you're fighting a guerrilla war and you get a truce, and you get a stalemate, and you get a draw, that means the guerrillas have won. And that's what happened in Ireland. Because it's arguable, I mean, my argument would not be, not necessarily that what happened in 1916, the violence in 1916 was justified. But what seems to me to be absolutely justified is the commemoration of 1916 as a seminal event, as the landmark on the path to Irish independence. Now, if you take the view, as I don't know whether Ruth or Kevin do, that you would have preferred Ireland never to become independent, that's a perfectly legitimate position to hold. And I would defend anybody's right. But what seems to me to be nonsensical is to take the view that, you know, everything would have been all right if only we'd stayed quiet, The British are a
But
beneficent people.
surely
that they would have
independence...
given independence.
Yeah. Surely it would have happened at some stage.
Why? There's no evidence to support it.
OK, well, I want to bring in Patsy McGarry.
No evidence whatever.
OK, no evidence.
I have to disagree profoundly with Professor Ronan and indeed Eamon's comment there about how if they allowed Ireland to gain their freedom, it would be the spark that would lead to the dismantling of the British Empire. I mean, already by the early 1900s, Australia, New Zealand, Canada and South Africa had Dominion status, which we secured through the truce at the Treaty of 1921, and little more than that. But I have to disagree also with Michael. This was not a morally complex issue. It's a morally very simple issue. The rising was, as the Attorney General of Northern Ireland said at the weekend, John Larkin, a Catholic, the first Catholic Attorney General of Northern Ireland, was profoundly wrong. It had neither constitutional nor democratic legitimacy. And that is a view that is gaining more and more currency, and with which I would have to say over a period of evolution over years, I profoundly believe myself. Those men, they ignored your grandfather who believed it wasn't going to succeed. They, a minority, decided to go ahead anyhow. They didn't even tell the men that they were leading out in the streets, and they were mainly men, whatever about the current fiction to try and give the impression that there were huge amounts of women involved. There were not. There were a few, certainly. But they led those men and they went out to their various Oland's Mills, Jacobs, Forecourts, whatever around the city. They didn't know, a lot of them, what they were doing. They thought the country was rising. Just as the week progressed, they realised otherwise. They led those men, most of them, many of them, to their deaths. They were responsible for the deaths of 485 people, as pointed out in that documentary. The vast majority of those, 254, were civilian, 40 were children, none of whom wanted to die. And for what?
Well, if we're going to get into the counting deaths.
No, we're talking about morality here.
No, I know, but let's talk about the morality of the sum. Let's talk about the nonsense about little
we're
Catholic.
We're talking about 1916 as in Dublin now. I'm more than
hold on a second, Patsy. You've had your chance.
Yeah.
If you're going to actually look at what happened, 1912. The provisional government in Ulster, the British Tory establishment saying, let me
Patsy,
finish,
please. Let him finish.
The British establishment said to a minority in Ireland, use force, threaten treason, establish a provisional government, and we will back you. And from the king down, they did back them. That's the situation. And the Irish people, on the other hand, who were asserting their claim to independence, were at every hand's turn being frustrated by British politicians.
True.
Yes.
Not true.
Yes,
Patsy,
indeed.
please.
Let him was granted in 1914.
Well, it was a home ruler. Pierce was a home ruler to begin with.
Patsy, can I let Eamon in?
That wasn't nonsense. It was the statute.
I think everybody here could agree on one thing, that war should be avoided at all costs.
Yes.
All war. But the idea that the British Empire wasn't based on force and imposing of force is, in my view, a myth.
I wish we wouldn't put in opinions into our mouths that we don't hold. We all know that the empire was created by force and maintained by force, by violence, often illegal, as the Indians were just discovered in Amritsar in 1919. In one single occasion, 1,000 unarmed Indians were slaughtered. We all know this, everyone watching the programme. So don't turn these events that we all agree on against us.
But he just said we all agree.
I'm just putting the point that to believe, therefore, that the British Empire were going to walk out of Ireland when they didn't walk out of India, which was a huge country, many, many miles further away, until 1948, after a huge campaign over many decades, but is, in my view, naive. Now, the second thing is...
But at least the Indians were able to say that they achieved that through peaceful resistance.
Well, to be quite honest, 1,000 people died, twice the number that died in 1916 in Amritsar. Now, unfortunately, when the British Empire were in control, people died because of the whole basis of the empire being at work. And I make one other point. The number of Irish people who died at the front on Easter week 1916 exceeds the total number of deaths in Dublin. Number 3, if we look at the deaths in Dublin, the reality is that a lot of civilians died because the British shelled the city and because they used machine guns indiscriminately in the city.
And because the rebels staged a revolution in a crowded area. And when Pierce realised they were going to use totally brutal methods to overcome the rising, he called it off. And I think when you look at the surrender, he talks about the prevention of civilian casualties.
On the other hand, Britain continued for a century and is still at waging wars when its interests are
very brief points.
And finally, can I say, when we look at how we used our independence, we were one of the few states that clearly states in its constitution about the judicial resolution of international disputes and have kept out of war and only got involved in peacekeeping.
Can I just say one thing, Patsy? There is the Government of Ireland Act of 1920. We had no rights to determine our own taxation. We had no rights to have international relations. We had no rights to do a myriad of things under this puppet regime, which was about as good as the Welsh Assembly is. If you believe in an independent Ireland, which I do, and the vast majority of Irish people do, this was a useless,
it was a bogus,
it was a bogus deal.
Excuse me, I want to let Ruth in.
Just as we're moving on, because there is a tendency here to attribute beliefs to each other, I'd like to make it clear about the First World War that I am proud of the Irishmen who fought in it, because by God, if we'd ended up being ruled by the Germans, we'd really have known what it was to have an evil empire, and we should bear that in mind.
Can I make a point here?
Yes,
we must remember something else about 1916. I mean, Eamon talks about the number of men who died in the Somme the same week, or in...
No, I'm not talking about Somme. I'm talking about...
Please let him finish it.
It's an aside, really. But 1916 is killing people still. It killed Adrian Ismay in Northern Ireland, that thinking behind it. It killed 3,500 people during the Troubles in Northern Ireland over 3 decades from the 70s, 80s and 90s.
I don't agree.
It is still being used, the same mindset, the same thinking, the same lack of morality to justify the activities of the new IRA, the real IRA, the continuity IRA, the dissident IRA, the INLA, the provosts, the officials.
What happened.
It's the same.
There was a general election in 1918. I'm sorry. There was a general election. You might not have liked the result.
It's retrospective.
And all this talk
justification
about
doesn't apply in law any more than politics.
Just war.
Okay, well, let me put a point.
The notion, just one point. No. The notion that if you've got a war, at least that if you're plotting a revolution, that you sit down with your pals who are plotting the revolution, and you say, now, before we go any further, we have to consider whether this constitutes a just war.
But
that is just
but you can
ludicrous.
use this.
That is not the way.
Ronan,
Maybe that should be the way revolutions work, but it's not the way revolutions work.
In your declaration, say we promise to protect the rights and liberties of the Irish people, and then proceed immediately to take those rights and liberties, as befell Constable Lahiff and Constable O'Brien and James Kavanagh opposite the Shelbourne Hotel, and all the 9 children who died that first day.
Okay, so I want to put this point to Eamon Cuiv, and I want to put it very clearly, the point that Patsy McGarry was raising, that what is the difference between a small, unrepresentative group deciding to stage a rising in the middle of Dublin without any democratic mandate whatsoever, and the provisionals during the Troubles, or dissident Republicans now? What is the difference?
2 very fundamental differences. The first fundamental difference is that the purpose of the 1916 Rising was to get rid of the power of the British Parliament in Ireland and the British King. Secondly, it clearly admonished us to be oblivious of the differences carefully fostered that separated a minority from the majority in the past. And therefore, it actually admonishes us, and it's a point I have often debated with Republicans and with my friends in the unionist community, that in fact a true Republican seeks peace with the unions in line with the proclamation. And the third thing, it talks specifically about taking power until there is a government elected by the suffrages of all her men and women. And therefore, it clearly lays down that as quick as you can get it left to the Irish people, there can be only one sovereign government, and that's the government of the people. And in fairness, the vast majority of the families of the leaders of 1916 and of the veterans of 1916 who survived it, including, if I might say so, my grandfather, bought into that dynamic, and that's what the 1937 Constitution was about. It was the first time in Irish history that a referendum, obviously it couldn't take place in 32 counties, but in this part of the island, a referendum took place that was government by the people, for the people. And interestingly enough, I think it's fair to say that this date this state has been incredibly peaceful. It was the part that remained under British domination that has the problem, not this state.
But Michael McDowell, one could invoke the blessing of dead generations to do just about anything, couldn't you?
You could, and I mean, obviously, you could say that was theatre and part of what Ruth was saying about almost creating a religion and an inheritance from dead people of some kind of moral right to use violence. It seems a bit implausible to our modern minds. But let's take a look at what had happened. You know, over a number of centuries, as the proclamation says, the Irish people had done everything they could possibly do. They'd had monster meetings at Clontarf. The repeal movement was savagely put down by British interests in Ireland. The 1798 rebellion was put down. The Fenians, in all their efforts, were suppressed. So let's be clear about this. When it comes to resisting the largest empire on earth by a country that believes it has the right to be independent, whether it's the colonialists in America or the people of Ireland, you have to be willing to use force. And you have to use, to some extent, underhand methods against the most brilliantly organised intelligent system that has ever existed on this planet.
But Michael,
and if you look, we now know, David, that Tom Clark, every single move he made from his shop in Capel Street, he was under constant.
Michael, the point Patsy was making was that you could use the same justification for the provost.
Oh, of course you could, and I mean, and by the way, an awful lot of the attack on 1916 and the revisionism in history has been motivated by a desire to somehow say the provos are wrong, therefore 1916 is wrong. And that's an inverted logic with due respect.
Let Ruth in. Sorry, Patsy, you let Ruth in.
The key point here is that they did not have public support until emotion took over, and later on there was retrospective justification. And that meant that any group that wanted to have a revolution believed that they would ultimately get retrospective justification. And that is what Sinn Féin are up to at the moment in their exhibition, with a whole room dedicated to the hunger strikers. They're trying to get the same status as the men of 1916 and the dissidents.
They're not succeeding.
Let Ronan.
They're not succeeding.
They are.
It's what they want to do.
The same thinking is being used to kill prisoners of war.
13% of the vote is what they have. So how is that succeeding?
If I can go back to Michael talking about 1798 and all, the 1803, you can list them all off, 1848, 7, whatever. Politics did work too, Michael. Politics got Catholic emancipation under Daniel O'Connell. Under Parnell and David, we got the greatest and only real revolution of the period in Irish history. The transfer of the ownership of the land of Ireland to a significant minority of the people of Ireland, and that grew afterwards. And politics did get home rule in September 1914.
You know
that's
what
fact.
Home rule, I'm sorry, was
it was on the statute. It was suspended because of the war.
Let me put
Patsy,
that point
do you believe for one minute,
Michael.
Patsy, do you believe for 1 minute that the Land Acts were all passed because there was no threat of violence against landlordism in Ireland? Of course it was.
Michael, I'm not saying violence.
Sorry,
But it's also a fact is that the Irish people, in the nearest thing they were likely to get to a referendum in 1918, and then subsequently in the election to the second time, declared a sovereign independent state. They set up a proper government. They sent their diplomats across the world. They set up their courts. In 1920, Cathal Brugh, seconded by Terence McSweeney, passed the resolution.
If it's a referendum, why did your grandfather execute 6 IRA during the war?
Because he was defending the interests of the state.
Let me finish.
He was defending, and he was right, because he was defending the interests of the state.
The British government, instead of saying, well, sorry, we now accept the will of the Irish people, suppressed the Dáil, suppressed the army out of the Dáil, suppressed all of the efforts, diplomatic and otherwise. Now, one of the interesting things about
if it was a referendum, in 1918, the referendum was failed because the Sinn Féin got 47% of the vote. You said that the British government moved against Dáil Éireann, and in response to that, the IRA started a campaign. No, on the first day the Dáil met, Sulla had begged. No, that you could use the term referendum.
Well, I did.
I am replying to that term referendum.
Sorry, gentlemen.
You said that the Dáil Éireann was suspended because of its political activities. What began on Dáil Éireann was that the murder of 2 police officers at Solihull Beg. The violence was initiated alongside the democratic process, and this is the disaster for Irish life. That instead of using constitutional methods from the time first Dáil Éireann chose to use violence. And we haven't got rid of that violence yet.
You're incorrect,
Eamon,
because, as I pointed out earlier, they did try between 16 and 19 to use peaceful methods. And what happened? They outlawed all the organisations they had. They were civilian organisations. And they arrested the leaders, including De Valera, who had been elected to their parliament.
Look, I'm not going to defend the British government. What I'm just saying is the use of violence in domestic circumstances simply was not justified.
We're all talking across each other and nobody can hear anything.
The election had been over
briefly.
long before Salah had.
It wasn't a domestic circumstance. And to take Patsy's point about why Eamon de Valera executed people during World War II.
IRA.
Yes,
Yeah.
and he did that because in 1937 there was a constitution passed which had been voted for by a majority of the people who voted.
Okay, very quick.
But they were
and he
following
passed
the
a freeze in
IRA
that.
please.
And from that point on, any act of violence against the state deserves to be treated in the way
And
that
Ruth said executed 77 in 1922 and 23.
Okay, sorry, gentlemen. Ruth wants to make
We're back to the same key point. What right did those 7 people have to start a revolution? Any more than the 7 of us now have to do the same. We can do it in the name of the dead generations. We have the justification, if they did. And if they did, the provos have it. If they did, the dissidents have it. And we're stuck with that, and we have to face the truth about
There is
1916.
one minor problem with that, David, and that is this. You are looking at it from the comfortable chair of living in a democracy. If you live in a country which is struggling for its independence against the greatest empire in the world, you cannot conduct that struggle on the basis of parliamentary democracy.
Michael,
it doesn't
the majority
work,
of people were happy with
it never worked.
Okay,
Michael, it was
I'm afraid we have run out of time, and no doubt we will hear a lot more of this debate over the coming week or so. But Eamon, Michael, Ronan, Kevin, Patsy and Ruth, thank you all very much for joining us. Miriam.
Well, that's the expert view, but if war means anything, it means death, it means sorrow, and it means loss. And we're joined now by people whose families did suffer real loss as a result of 1916, on different sides and with very different views as to whether or not that loss could ever be justified. So what are their stories, and do they feel that 100 years after the event, their loved ones are being properly remembered and their lives properly celebrated? I'm not going to introduce you all at the beginning, and I'm going to start straight away with you, Cathal McSweeney-Brew. 2 very famous grandfathers, Terence McSweeney and Cathal Brew. But tell me about Cathal Brew, because he's an iconic figure in relation to 1916.
Well, he was very much into sport. He was very strong. He was a very determined person. He was one of the people who went and scouted around the sites for the 1916 Rising, and decided to hold out in the South Dublin Union, which was a very good vantage point overlooking some British positions and overlooking the canal. And the whole idea was to create difficulty for the British. It turns out that they were never defeated. It turns out that the British made 2 severe attacks, and in one of them he was very severely wounded, 25 serious wounds, and he managed to hold out for a few hours. Actually singing to stay conscious because he'd been so badly wounded, and then when the British withdrew, he then continued singing, and then Eamon Cant and the others heard him singing, and they said, wow, he's still okay, and they came back to look after him. It turns out then that because he was a senior person, but they thought he was going to die, they didn't bring him, didn't execute him, and they didn't send him over to Frongach in Wales. So he ended up reorganising the volunteers in the Citizen Army later in 1916, and that's how he emerged and ended up as Minister for Defence in the War of Independence.
And when you and I were watching earlier the previous discussion, you were getting quite annoyed at some of the things you were listening to, weren't you?
Well, I was thinking that these are historians, and I'm saying this is family. you know, and I was really thinking that it seemed to be very artificial. They were talking about, you know, well, if this was County Longford or County Westmeath, they could have had an election, you know. The difference between Ireland and Britain was so totally different. We weren't allowed to do what we wanted to do. 700 years we were treated either that you grew food or you grew soldiers, and the soldiers were put on the front line for war after war after war. It was not a proper life.
On my other side here, Ken Wolfe, tell me about your great-grandfather's story.
So my great-grandfather's name was William Rowe. He came from County Wexford. I don't know much about his background because he was an orphan. I don't know who his parents were. But when he was 20 years old, he joined the Royal Irish Constabulary. But he gradually got promoted up the ranks. And when he was 48, he became head constable in Fermoy RIC station. So that's where he was in 1916. And at the end of that week, the RIC were ordered essentially to round up the volunteers. So my great-grandfather was sent out to arrest the Kent brothers. It ended up in a standoff and a shootout. My great-grandfather was shot dead. One of the Kent brothers was shot dead. Another Kent brother was badly wounded. And the two surviving brothers were taken into custody. That was Thomas Kent and his brother William. Thomas Kent was court-martialed 2 days later and executed about a week later for his part in that incident.
And now, obviously, all of us know that Kent Station is obviously called after Thomas Kent in Cork, but there's nothing to remember your father. Do you think that's fair or unfair?
The only memorial to my great-grandfather is actually in London, in St. Paul's Cathedral. I think it is sad that when he was a casualty of the Rising 1916, it was a tragedy for both families. I think it would be fitting that everybody who died in Easter 1916 should be remembered. So I'm very glad to see that the government is actually putting a wall of memory for all the casualties in Glasnevin.
Mary Gallagher, you're grandniece of Eamon Kent. I'm conscious we're all sitting here in the GPO right now. Remind us of his role in his story, and also there's a very interesting story about the two brothers there.
Well, Eamon Kent is obviously one of the signatories of the 1916 proclamation. He was the commandant of the 4th Battalion and led his men to the South Dublin Union, now St. James's Hospital, on Easter Monday in 1916. But the backstory to that is that Eamon Kent was the son of an RIC head constable. He was born in Ballymoe when his father was posted there, and the family moved originally to Drogheda and Ardee and then later to Dublin. He had one brother who was an RIC constable as well, JP, and he had another brother, Bill, my uncle Bill, who was in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. One of the things I did find particularly moving, though, was after Eamon was executed, Bill was sent out to the front just in time for the Battle of the Somme. Now, my grandfather, who had been horrified at the extent to which Eamon was involved in the 1916 Rising initially, but equally turned his views around, having seen his brother executed, he felt that Bill had been sent out to the front in retaliation for Eamon's role in 1916, and he wrote this in his diary. But when I went back to research the family life for the biography of Eamon that I was writing a few years ago, I found Bill's letters to my grandfather back in Ireland from the Somme, and he said in those letters that I couldn't stay away, I couldn't let them go on without me, words to that effect. So you see different perspectives when you actually go back to the historical record.
I've got to take a break now. I'll come back to talk to all of the rest of you in a moment. Join us in a few moments. We're going to take a commercial break.